A very good morning to all of you. Warm welcome to my presentation. And today's lecture will be on the topic fiscal policy. So today we are going to discuss about the current situation in the economy and how it is going to impact the US economy, and we'll give examples relating to the impact of COVID-19 on the fiscal policy. We'll discuss about various aspects of government spending, and at the end there will be question and answers. In this chapter we have 4 learning objectives. After completing this chapter, you will be able to use the traditional Keynesian analysis to evaluate the effect of discretionary fiscal policy. Objective 2 is to discuss the ways in which indirect crowding out and direct expenditure offsets can reduce the effectiveness of fiscal policy actions. The third learning objective is to list and define the fiscal policy time lags and explain why they complicate efforts to engage in fiscal fine-tuning. The fourth learning objective is to describe how certain aspects of the fiscal policy function as automatic stabilizers for the economy. So today what I'm going to do, I'll create separate videos for different learning objectives, and this will help you to understand the topic better because of the smaller duration of the presentation. Our second learning objective is to discuss the ways in which indirect crowding out and direct expenditure offsets can reduce the effectiveness of the fiscal policy actions. So, fiscal policy does not operate in vacuum. We need to answer some of the important questions like, what are the expenditure which are financed and by whom it is financed? Number 2, if taxes are increased, what does the government do with these taxes? Whether it spends on military, education, healthcare facilities, what is done with the taxes? What will happen if the individual worry about increase in the future taxes? Sometimes, the expectation of increase and decrease of taxes can change the mindset of individuals. So what do you have to do if there will be increase in the taxes? All these questions involve offset to the effect of current fiscal policy, and we'll consider them in detail in the subsequent slides. So we have to know what is crowding out effect. After that, we can focus on various possible offsets to fiscal policy. Crowding out effect is the tendency of the expansionary fiscal policy to cause a decrease in the planned investment or planned consumption in private sector, and this decrease normally results from high interest rate. So if there will be high interest rate, what you do? You'll borrow less, right? So when you will borrow less, you have less money for consumption. If you are an individual or household, you will consume less. If you are a farm, then you will spend less on the capital goods or
any kind of inventories or any kind of investments. So it will decrease the planned expenditure on the investment. There is increase in the government expenditure, and that government spending or expenditure, it increases or exceeds the tax revenue. Okay, the tax revenue is income for government, right? But if government spends more than their income, more than their revenues, then what will happen? Government deficit will occur. Yes, it will increase the government deficit. So if the government expenditure rises and taxes are held constant, someone has to give, right? So our government does not simply take goods and services when it wants them. It has to pay for them. And when it pays for them and does not simultaneously collect the same amount in taxes, what it will do? It will borrow money. So government will seek more funds from the saver to compensate this deficit, to finance this deficit. And they will induce the savers to provide more funds. Government will ask for funds by offering the individuals, households, farms, foreign residents by a higher amount of interest rate, right? So if someone asks you for money, they should have something in return, right? So government returns higher interest rate by requesting for more funds, by inducing the savers to provide government for more funds. This means that an increase in the spending without raising the taxes create additional government borrowing from the private sector or from other foreign residents. So if the government attempts to borrow in excess of what is required, then there is a higher interest rate to get that additional funds from the saver. This interest rate effect of the expansionary fiscal policy is financed by borrowing from the public. So consequently, when the federal government finances increased spending by additional borrowing, what will happen? It will increase the interest rate. When interest rate goes up, firms' borrowing cost will rise, and it will induce them to cut back on the planned investment expenditure. Similarly, any kind of borrowing cost like loans, will increase for the households, for you, for me, and what will do? Will reduce our expenditure. Maybe we'll reduce expenditure we already planned for buying a car or a home. Maybe we'll reduce all these expenditures on car or home. So a rise in government spending holding taxes constant, that is a deficit spending, tends to crowd out private spending, and it dampens the positive effect of increased government spending on aggregate demand, and this is called as crowding out effect. And finally, what will happen? Few private investment projects are undertaken, and that final result will lead to more government spending and less private investment and consumption. So all of you pay your attention to this figure that shows the crowding out effect. Here, the economy is in a situation in which at the point E1, the equilibrium real GDP is below the long run level, consistent with the position of the long run aggregate supply curve. Suppose, however, the government expansionary fiscal policy in the form of increased government spending without increasing the current taxes attempts to shift the aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2. In the absence of crowding out effect, the real GDP would increase to $18 trillion per year and the price level would rise to $120. You can see over there at E2. With the partial crowding out effect, however, an investment and the consumption it decline, partly offsetting the rise in government spending, and the aggregate demand curve shifts inward to the left to AD3. The new short-run equilibrium is at E3 with the real GDP of $17.75 trillion per year at a price level of $115. So we can say in the conclusion that crowding out actually dilutes the effect of expansionary fiscal policy and a recessionary gap remains. If you have any questions relating to this figure, feel free to write your question on the Google Doc that I have shared with you. Ricardian equilibrium theorem proposes that an increase in the government budget deficit has no effect on aggregate demand. Do you agree with his theorem that if there will be increase in the government budget deficit, there will be no effect on aggregate demand? And why? As per his theorem, people anticipate that a larger deficit today will mean higher taxes in future and adjust their spending accordingly. According to the Ricardian equivalence theorem, it doesn't matter how government expenditure are financed, whether by taxes or by borrowing. Can you start thinking that which is appropriate? By increasing the taxes, government want to have funds, or they have to borrow from different countries or other institutions, households, various farms. What is the right approach? As per Ricardian theorem, it doesn't matter whether by taxes or borrowing. It doesn't matter how the expenditure are financed. There is another hypothesis which is called as permanent income hypothesis. And what is that? It is also known as the theory of consumption. The theory of consumption, which is known as the permanent income hypothesis, asserts that an individual's current consumption depends on the anticipated lifetime income. So over your lifetime, how much money as a income you are going to generate, that will actually determine how much you are going to consume as per this theory. So a temporary tax cut or rebate tends to have minimal effects on aggregate consumption. So what do you think? Which theory you liked? Do you like the Ricardian theorem or this permanent income hypothesis? We can now discuss on the direct expenditure offsets. What do you mean by direct expenditure offsets? These are the actions on the part of private sector in spending income that offset the government fiscal policies. Actions. Any increase in the government spending in an area that competes with the private sector will have some direct expenditure offset. Government has a distinct comparative advantage over the private sector in certain activities like diplomacy and national defense. Otherwise stated, certain resource using activities in which government engages do not compete with the private sector. In contrast, some of what government does, such as public education, competes directly with the private sector. When government competes with the private sector, direct expenditure offsets to fiscal policy may occur. For example, government start providing milk at no charge to students who were already purchasing milk, and there is a direct expenditure offset. Direct household spending on the milk decreases, but government spending on milk increases. Normally, the impact of an increase in the government spending on aggregate demand is analyzed by implicitly assuming that government spending is not a substitute for private spending. This is clearly the case whenever the government spending is a substitute for private spending, that is the cruise missile. However, a rise in the government spending can cause direct reduction in the private spending to offset it. Higher government research and development includes competing, firms that cut R&D spending, and it generate direct fiscal offset. If the government invests in infrastructure to support the ISP, that is your internet service provider, private sector reduce the spending that diminishes the value of government investment. So as the government spends more money, private sector businesses typically spend less. Earlier, we have already discussed about changing taxes and changing government spending, which is generally the traditional tools of fiscal policy, or two ways of fiscal policy. Either you increase or decrease the taxes, or increase and decrease the government expenditure or spending. These are the traditional tools of fiscal policy. Now let us consider the possibility of changing the marginal tax rate. What will happen if there will be some changes in the tax rate? So marginal tax rate is the rate which is applied to the last or highest bracket of taxable income. In our federal tax system, higher marginal taxes are applied as the income rises, right? More the income, more is the taxes. In that sense, the United States has a progressive federal individual income tax system. Expansionary fiscal policy could involve reducing the marginal tax rate. Advocates of such changes, they argue that lower tax rate will lead to increase in the productivity. And this, they say that the individuals, they will work harder because now the tax rates are low. So they will work harder because they will feel that if we work harder, we can save more, invest more, and that way when they invest more, there will be increase in the productivity that will lead to economic growth, because now the money will be invested in different types of equipment, furniture, capital goods, all those things that leads to more production, and that will actually help you to increase the economic growth, enhance the economic growth. And when there will be more economic growth, it will lead to higher real GDP. So the government, by applying lower marginal tax, will not necessarily lose the tax revenues, for the lower marginal tax will be applied to a growing tax base because of the economic growth. After all, tax revenues are the product of tax rate times a tax base. So if you want to find out what are the amount of, what is the amount of tax revenue, what you have to do, multiply the tax rate with a tax base. The relationship between the tax rates and tax revenues, can be discussed in the Laffer curve, which we'll discuss in the subsequent slides. So remember, ultimately, the marginal tax rate will not necessarily reduce the tax revenues because the tax base will be larger. So let us now understand the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve is a theory which is developed by the supply side economist Arthur Laffer to show the relationship between the tax rates and the amount of the tax revenue which is collected by the government. This curve is used to illustrate his main premise that the more an activity such as production is taxed, the less of it being generated. So if you keep on charging more and more amount of tax, actually the production activity, the efficiency will decline. Likewise, the less an activity is taxed, the more of it is being generated. So we can say that tax revenue initially rise with a higher tax rate as indicated over here in this figure, and eventually, however, the tax revenues will decline as the tax rate will increase. And when we are talking about this supply side economics, basically it is the suggestion that is creating incentives for the individuals and firm to increase productivity, which will cause the aggregate supply curve to shift outward. People who support the notion that reducing the tax rate does not necessarily lead to reduced tax revenues are called as supply side economists. Supply side economics involves changing the tax structure to create incentives that will enhance productivity. Due to a shift in the aggregate supply curve to the right, there can be greater real GDP without upward pressure on the price level. If you have any thoughts, any ideas, any questions on this, feel free to write your views, your own thoughts on the Google Doc that I have provided to you or in the discussion board, on the discussion board.